of domestic violence involves a weapon. 1 in 4 women, compared to 1 in 18 men, have been stalked by an intimate partner. And I want to give you the whole numbers for that to put that in more context. 19.3 million women, compared to 5.1 million men in the United States. 72% of all murder suicides involve intimate partner violence. 72%. 94% of victims of murder suicides are female. And then last, 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence. And 90% of those are eyewitnesses to the violence. So I just thought it was important for us to start this conversation with some of the statistics to help people understand why we do what we do, why this is so important to us. We've all been affected by this topic in a variety of ways, and we're all lending our time, our voice to advocate as best we can. So I want to get started. We're going to jump right in because this time is going to fly by. It's going to go by so fast, and I want to make sure that we hear from all of you. But I want to start with you, Makya, as the founder of Oshun's Garden. Can you tell us, and your Oshun's Garden is actually the sponsor of this event today and the host. So I just want you to share a little bit about the organization and what it is as the founder you're hoping to accomplish through the vision and mission of the organization.
Okay, first of all, hello everybody, to each of our panelists and to our attendees. Thank you for joining us today. So first and foremost, for Oshun's Garden, a lot of it, honestly, the idea starts in undergrad. A lot of my focus with my work was on the intersection of race and gender and how Black women are affected disproportionately by systems of social inequality. The Oshun's Garden as an organization didn't come to be until about 2018. And at that time, it was a very broad mission. It was just, I wanted a space for Black women on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, because here we don't really have those spaces as much. And it wasn't until recently, I've been at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore for a year now, which is an HBCU, and I was looking for culturally specific resources for gender-based violence, and it was so hard for me to find it. We have crisis centers and things like that in Maryland, but they were missing the cultural piece. And I wanted to have something that could resonate with Black college students and students of color. So I recognized then that, okay, Oshun's Garden has to have the specific mission that is addressing gender-based violence and the ways that it affects Black women, because it's a different, I guess, foundation. And when I say that, I mean, I'm looking at the structural violence that creates these more instances of more direct violence that we see. So I wanted Oshun's Garden to begin to do that work. So we're still growing, we're still expanding. It's a very early time for the organization, but that will be our mission at this time.
And so I met Makya. She invited me to be on her, a part of her panel discussion for her annual event last February. Fabulous event, very well attended, and we connected, and she invited me to be on her board of advisors as she continues to evolve the organization. And so I'm really happy to be able to support her on her journey. I want to go to the rest of the panel, and I'll start with you, Wanda. What motivates you or inspires you to be involved as an advocate, or to work in this space of providing your services and your knowledge?
First of all, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much, Makya, for creating this space, because like you said, it is beyond needed. It's so important. So thank you for all the work that you're doing. My motivation, Annette, very simply is that I'm a survivor, of domestic violence. And when I was experiencing it, there wasn't anywhere near this amount of talk about it. As a matter of fact, it wasn't even called domestic violence then. It was just a battered women syndrome. And victims were referred to as battered women. There was no kind of context to put it in. They had shelters, but it literally was just that, to house you until you could find a place to go. There wasn't a whole lot of resources. So my motivation to just be an advocate and to, work with survivors and victims as well, is a direct result of me being a survivor and having the experience.
And so I met Wanda working with a resource based in New Jersey, Start Out Fresh Intervention Advocates, where I worked on the board and volunteered with them, and then became a part of Wanda's stage play, Not Just October, which she's going to share more about that later. I still can't believe that you got me to do that, Wanda, but it was the best experience of my life. Althea, what about you?
Oh, let me take myself off of mute. Well, my name is Althea Simpson, and I became an advocate later in my career as a mental health professional. I am a child witness of domestic violence, and I was psychologically and emotionally abused as a child. But witnessing domestic violence literally took my voice. And back then, it wasn't until I switched over from the business realm to the mental health realm that I realized what happened to me was I became selectively mute. And I remember the very incident that took my voice away from me. And with that, in school, I would not respond to the teachers. I knew the answers, but I was afraid to talk. And it landed me in special education. So being a child witness of domestic violence landed me in special education. I had a debut on a news channel where the newscaster had a commentary about special education in the DC public school system. And I ended up getting signed up to be on that. And from there, the bullying came. Not only was I called stupid and dumb in the house, it was in school, it was in the community. So once I was able to do my own work, I was able to start becoming an advocate for others.
Althea, we share very, very similar stories. That's how I got involved in this work, because I witnessed violence in my home against my mother, and it took away my voice. I was very introverted, very silent, which is why I do the work that I do now. And I never say no. I probably say yes too much. I overbook myself, but any opportunity I have to speak up, I speak up to atone for all of those years that I was silent. So thank you for sharing that. Mr. Jeffries, I'm your biggest fan, Shavar Jeffries. I tell you that all the time. What brings you to do the work that you do and lend your voice?
Well, I love you and Wanda and Makya and Althea sound amazing too, and I look forward to getting to know them. But I like many, really everyone on this panel, have a personal connection, which is what brings me to the work. My mother was a victim of domestic violence, and I just saw up front how it just devastated our whole family. My mother would file for restraining orders, so my stepfather was abusive to my mom, and I would see how she would file restraint. I witnessed a few of these incidents, and this was a strong, man, and my mom was very petite, and he was very jealous. He would look at the phone bills. This is back in the day when we had the paper phone bills, and had to pay for long distance, and they would list all the numbers. So he'd ask questions about the numbers, and just he would beat my mom, and it was horrible. And I might not be here because what happened was 2 weeks before he would kill my mother, we left. So we're on the run. We're in shelters for a while. We're at couches of friends of my mom. He didn't know where we were, but he knew where my mom worked, and he waited for her at the job. And I just saw how restraining order after restraining order was ignored, how there was no one to protect us. The police would just file paperwork and things. If anything, he would become more upset, when she would call the cops. And so I really dedicated a large part of my career as a civil rights attorney to whether it's doing litigation work to protect victims of domestic violence. I've done a lot of work with men because given the stats, Annette, that you laid out at the beginning, there's no question, there are male victims as well, but the predominant part of this problem is caused by men. And men having misogynistic and sexist ideas about their capacity to have control over women's body. Their belief that if women make choices they don't agree with, they should be able to exert control over that and use violence to sustain that. So I've done a lot of work with men to unpack that so that men can engage in the healing they need to engage into so that they can be what a true man ought to be, which is, supportive and respectful. And so it's that personal connection that motivates me into this work. And part of the reason I'm so excited to be here with you today.
And Shavar, I know you get called on a lot. You've been so supportive to Start Out Fresh intervention advocates. You didn't even hesitate. I think you even had a conflict today and you were moving stuff around to be here with us. And so I just want to give you an extra shout out and say thank you so much.
Anytime for you in this cause.
And for your generosity of time.
Appreciate
So we're
that.
talking about domestic violence, and we use the term intimate partner violence, and they're used interchangeably a lot. Can we just help those who are watching? Is there a difference? And can we just put some descriptors to that? Like, what do we mean when we say domestic violence or intimate partner violence?
To me, there's no distinction other than I think that the goal of changing the name was to separate domestic violence as it relates to the whole household and intimate partner violence as it relates to a couple that may not be married, or there may not be a household involved. And so it was just a way to kind of narrow it down a little bit. I personally am not sure that I agree with it. I think that it allows for too many variables when the bottom line is that it's abuse against another. And it needs to be addressed. But that's my take on the difference, is that domestic violence was more of a broader term, and they were trying to, just kind of let everybody know or send the message that domestic violence usually happens between a couple, whether that are intimately involved in some way, shape, or form, as well as not be gender biased as well with it, because it just couples are couples. So I think that was my take on it.
And so I know that were you going to say something, Makya?
Yeah, I was going to say, for the context, again, coming from a college campus, for the context of our students, we use both, but we use intimate partner violence because it also signifies that the couple may not be living together. And I think that's also a distinction that needs to be made. Domestic, most times you are going to assume that they are in the same household, which isn't always the case.
Okay. So give some examples. I know you're both involved, Makya, Wanda, you're both involved in training and education. What are some of the signs that you share with people when you're doing training, like things that they should look for in terms of potentially being in an abusive relationship?
So there's obvious things like excessive arguing, name calling, controlling the money, controlling where you go, isolating you, slowly starting to, only want to spend time with you, not allowing you to spend time with friends and family, monitoring your behavior, just any kind of control. What I tend to emphasize sometimes is that we're looking for a pattern, because if, I could be with someone, we could have an argument. They may call me a name, I might call them a name. That doesn't mean that I'm in an abusive relationship. It means we had an argument that escalated. But if that keeps happening, and it becomes a pattern, that's when you want to just kind of take another look at the situation that you might be in, because it always starts out very subtle. It doesn't, and by the time it does escalate, the damage, if you will, is usually already done, which is why it always starts out with emotional, and mental abuse. So by the time the physical abuse hits, you're already at a point where you think you deserve it, or you're just not sure how to cope with it. So definitely the obvious signs, but I emphasize the pattern. Look for the pattern.
And Althea, I'm going to ask you to build off of that, because you work in the mental health space, and a big part of abuse too is the emotional and the mental. So how does that show up in the work that you do and the support and services that you provide?
Well, and also domestic violence includes, sibling violence, parent-child violence. So we can't miss those either. And so in the mental health space, emotional abuse is when someone is constantly berating you and putting you down. Psychological abuse is the threatening of where you feel threatened. And you also have financial abuse, which a lot of people miss the financial abuse,
Mhm.
where the other partner has control over the money, and the financial situation is what you're going to buy, what you're going to eat. And that just shows up. It shows up for children, it shows up for adults, it shows up for men, and it shows up for women. And a lot of people dismiss the emotional abuse because a lot of people are in that old adage of sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt. Words do hurt.
Mhm.
I am an example of words that hurt. And even to this day, I've done my own work. I'm a therapist with a therapist. I am a trauma specialist. So I have to make sure that I go to therapy because I get triggered by some of the things that I hear. I get triggered by things that I remember. And that emotional piece of it shows up in your life. And what people don't realize is that trauma, you don't get past trauma. Your trauma doesn't go away. No one can rid you of your trauma. You can work through it, you can move past it, but it becomes a part of your DNA. And a lot of people don't see domestic violence as trauma because you were not physically hit. So the emotional and the psychological abuse is easily dismissed.
Mhm. And I think that's a great segue into the theme for this panel discussion is denormalizing and deconstructing abusive relationships. And I think you have to talk about the myths and the stereotypes that are involved. Because I didn't start talking about my experience until I was 50. And that's because I went into therapy. And so sometimes I would get comments made to me about, you're not over that yet? That was 50, that was 40 something years ago. You mean that still affected you? Like you weren't abused, that was your mother. So there would be these comments that I would be like taken aback. So what are some of the myths? And I want to start with you, Shavar, because as a man, I'm wondering if you hear things differently as it relates to myths and stereotypes about abusiveness or about domestic violence.
Yeah, I mean, I'll hear from men a lot of excuses and explanations. So I spend a lot of time talking to men about these issues, and I'll hear men. I try not to generalize. The type of men who are generally Black men that I've had most of my experience and history with tend not to be very introspective about many things, right? So they're just not as reflective as we really need to be on many, many fronts. Then, we still have much patriarchy in our society. So we have a lot of men who've kind of grown up with certain norms and understandings about women and what women should do and the man's role in relation to the women and that sort of thing. And then particularly in relationships, if the woman no longer wants to be with the man or if the woman is exploring other options with other men, that's where the combination of all that can become very, very toxic and very, very, and even violent and abusive, whether it's emotional and psychological or ultimately physical. And so I definitely hear a lot of men who have excuses and explanations about what's transpired, who don't have the tools. I mean, very few of us, regardless of gender, and I think probably even more so of men, have really learned how to resolve disputes, how to resolve disagreements, how to have healthy relationships.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, because many of us grew up in families where there wasn't intentional conversations around what healthy relationships look like. Many of us may have grown up in families where there actually were unhealthy relationships and unhealthy practices. And we haven't done the work that I find, generally speaking, and you can get into trouble with these generalizations. I just find, generally speaking, I think women just are generally more likely to do the work, to go to the therapy, right, to reflect and to be introspective. And that's a space where I think men are starting to get there. But we still have a lot of work to do to say, Therapy is cool. That's necessary. That's healing, right? There's nothing to where you feel that's not what a brother is supposed to do. No, that's exactly what we have to do, right? Because we've dealt with a lot, particularly as men of color. And so, so yes, I try to be a voice to intervene, and and to be clear, I'm now 45. I really didn't get to this type of space in my own journey until maybe the last 10 years. I always had this thing in my mind of what happened to my mom was horrible, and somebody has to pay. And if I see men doing that, they got to pay, right? So it's kind of that retributionist sort of thing, which really isn't. I've learned through my own therapy walk that's not really healthy, and that's. I even had a therapist talk to me about the fact that when I was young and I would see my mother being abused, I was so young, and my stepfather was a big, strong man. I couldn't do anything about it. So they helped me see I'm trying to protect folk and bring retribution, which really itself isn't healthy. So I've had to get to my own walk on that. So in any event, yes, I think as men, we have to be comfortable with therapy and engaging and unpacking our trauma. Understanding it's a lifelong journey, understand how trauma's affected us. And so I think in this age, we're definitely better than I think we used to be in terms of at least having these conversations. I've even seen, famous NBA athletes like this brother DeMar DeRozan talk about how he's in therapy, and Kevin Love, who's a famous, and even LeBron James has talked about it. So I think it's becoming a bit more, we're denormalizing, not engaging this, but it's still not normal the way it needs to be yet.
And I want to reemphasize your empathy, because we are not, and that's a disclaimer, we're not here to beat up on men. We're not here to cast judgment. We are here to raise awareness, to educate, highlight resources, and to use our voice to reiterate the criticalness of this discussion and how important it is for us to seek help on both sides, right? So I wanted to just thank you for the empathy, because I think that's critical to this discussion. Makya, what are some of the stereotypes or myths that you deal with on campus?
I think that, and I guess this ties into a little bit with the myths, but I want to point out that with this whole normalizing, denormalizing, and deconstructing conversation, the main point of that was to really address the cultural and social norms that perpetuate and reinforce this culture of violence, right? And that's literally what I want the focus of Oshun's Gardens work to be. So for our students, we normally use some people may or may not have heard of the power and control wheel, but we also use the violence pyramid. Is everyone familiar with that? So it kind of shows that before you can even get to the top of the pyramid with violence, at the bottom, you're already seeing sexist language and stereotypes and things like that. And so at the basis of this, this violence is really gender inequality, and that's reinforced by stereotypes that make women out to be subordinate and weak and, below a man. So going back to Shavar mentioning patriarchy and addressing those gender norms is really a start to this work.
So I want to pick up go back to the mental health aspect of this and ask you, Althea, do you think that rehabilitation for abusers is something that is being cared for today? Or I don't always hear in my discussion and the circles that I'm in a lot of talk about rehabilitating the abuser. So I'm just wondering if you're seeing anything that's evolving around that.
Absolutely. There are programs, and especially with the courts being involved, sending abusers to, or perpetrators to, anger management. One of the things that we have to understand that a lot of this is not, there's always something behind the anger. So you really can't just look at it from an anger management standpoint. There's specific treatment for domestic violence, and you have different programs on different levels for domestic violence. But yes, and I see, and the biggest thing is not if you want to reunify the family or keep the family together, you have to create a safe space, a safe therapeutic space. So for me, practicing from this standpoint, I address a lot of victim shaming and blaming.
Mm.
That's something that I really feel that we have to throw out the window. Just because you were able to walk away from a situation doesn't mean it's that easy for someone else to walk away from a situation. Let them have their process. And even when I train and talk about this, my goal is not to get a victim to leave their environment. It's to help them create safety in the environment that they choose to stay in and to develop a plan. So because that blaming and that shaming can keep them attached even longer. Right. And so you have to look at it, and it's just not one size fit all. It's multi-layered, it's multi-tiered when you are treating domestic violence victims and perpetrators from a mental health standpoint. Say family therapy is important, but I will not do family therapy if the perpetrator or the abuser hasn't gone through their own therapy, their own individual therapy, because it has to be a safe environment for everyone, everyone in the room.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, Shavar, I'm curious, because you said that, you know, you're helping men in this space and you're doing work without violating any confidentiality, of course. Like, what are those conversations like? Like, what are some of the messages that are being shared in terms of mental health help or emotional help or whatever?
Yeah, I mean it's a diversity. We'll have conversations about everything from I snapped and I'm just very, very sorry, and uh, you know, I have to control myself better. And then we will have the sort of conversations Althea talked about. And again, I then refer them to people because, you know, I'm not a
Right.
therapist, I'm not an expert, I'm just a person who cares and wants to kind of connect people to resources. But we will have conversations around, well, let's dig underneath that, right? You don't, you know, what caused you to snap? What caused you to snap in this way in relationship to this woman that then led to violence, right? And so then we'll get into some of the, you know, gendered ideas underneath that. Some are different. Some have excuses. They have explanations of what she shouldn't have done, and she did this, and she disrespected. So we'll hear that frame a lot. She disrespected me when she did whatever it was. She talked to this person and that sort of thing. And then I'll work to have conversation around, you don't control her. She can do what she want to do.
Right.
Who are you? Right. I mean, so we'll do that. Like, you don't tell folk what to do. She's a grown person, and get into that. And then, you know, those type of guys can have a sense of dominion. Like, that's my woman and all of that. And so, you know, so we'll have those sort of conversations. And then some, you know, they've seen this in their household, where some saw their mom victimized, and then that goes in a lot of different places where, you know, some saw their mom victimized and they were victimized. And then some of them blame their mom because she didn't, you know, we talked about the victim shaming. She didn't do things to protect herself or the child. Then you have some others who, you know, just think violence is a way to resolve disputes because they saw that. And so those are the kinds of things that, you know, that I've seen. You know, and I will say this is also a selective group, because the guys that I end up in interaction with are people who are at least trying to be better. Right, so they're trying to get to a different place, right? As you know, they stumbling along as it might be, and as 2 steps forward, 1 step back as it might be, they're trying to make progress. So the guys who are out there who are just kind of not even intentional, thoughtful, I tend not to come into contact with. But so that's where these guys are. And what I really try to do is say, look, we got to work on healthy relationships. Let me connect you with folks who are experts in these spaces. But what has to stop, you got to put your hands in your pocket. That just can't happen. And also, you obviously be thoughtful about your words, because we know that's serious abuse as well. I tend to start with the physical with these guys, just because that, you know, can lead to all types of outcomes that you can't recover from. So yeah, those are the type of conversations, Annette, that I've had with folks.
Okay. And so, Makya, I want to come back to you, because I know that through Ocean's Garden, you want to increase education around intimate partner violence, from just gender to people who are in abusive relationships, right? Because we tend to focus primarily on men and women. And statistics show, yes, men are impacted by domestic violence as well, but overwhelmingly, the number of people who are impacted are women at the hands of men. But what are you hoping to what are you hoping to do by way of education, Makya, through educational programs or awareness programs?
So I want to go back a little bit to when I discovered that there was this shortage of culturally relevant resources. Part of that was also making sure that it was reaching an audience that we would not normally reach with webinars. So statistically, we know that most people who register for webinars are those who are already interested in the topic, right? And we want to reach those people who may not sign up for a webinar like this, who may not attend a training that's going on in the community when it's not online. We want to reach those people, and particularly for me, a younger crowd. So even though we're moving into this mission of focusing on violence, I don't want to lose the flair of the cultural events that we were doing before. So the brunches. For those who aren't familiar with Oshun's Garden, we also created the first Eastern Shore Cypher, which was a group of women in hip hop who were, making this track, or social media, but using different elements to reach people and young people that we wouldn't reach with just webinars like this. So I also think it's important to think about who we're getting in front of when we're doing community outreach. And again, not just events that are circled around things like this, but places where people may not think to see an organization like this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. You talked about some of the art forms that you created events around to raise education. And I want to shift to you, Wanda, because you're a survivor, you're trained at responding to situations, and you do a lot of education and awareness, but you created Not Just October, which is a stage play. And I want you to talk about what motivated you to do that, and what was your intention? What did you want people to walk away from that experience with?
And we just celebrated our 2-year anniversary, right? Of the debut of Not Just October. So initially my motivation for that was during the work that I was doing and just in my own healing process, what I started to see is that victims, survivors, friends and family, nobody really wanted to talk about it. And I think we all know that. It's not an intentional thing where they want to talk about it. But what I started to see is that people would listen. If other people were talking about it, they would listen. And they would listen to see whether they could identify with it. They would listen to see whether or not they weren't alone in their journey. And so a lot of times just listening to somebody else talk about it or somebody else share their story would give people hope and courage and just revelation, actually, in some parts that people didn't even realize, that they were victims, whether directly or indirectly. So Not Just October came about to, first of all, just like the name says, domestic violence is not just October, it's every day. And so the goal was to give victims and survivors a platform to share their story, to also educate. And so I think that part of the play was we identified 3 different areas, home, school, and church. One of the abuse scenarios that we didn't discuss, or we don't really mention a lot either, is spiritual abuse. It's very real. It's very real. So we focused on home, school, work, and the community. And we focused on also like the 4 biggest issues, right? What are the warning signs? Why does she stay? And like Althea mentioned, safety planning. And then what about the children? Because a lot of, for the most part, a victim did not wake up one day and become a victim. An abuser did not wake up one day and become an abuser. Something happened when they were children that triggered them in some way, shape, or form to either become, their self-esteem and all of that was affected. So we also wanted to focus on the children. I did not use actors. We used actual survivors. And I have to say, and Annette can attest to this, it was a huge healing process. Anytime a victim or survivor has an opportunity to share their story, another layer peels off. We actually have a question, Annette, in the chat.
Okay.
It's in the attendee chat, and I think that the question.
Can you see the question?
Yeah, I can see it.
Can you read it to us?
Sure, and because I think it kind of relates to what we're talking about right now. Okay. And the attendee was speaking about the get over it already myth, and how that's all we hear. And she says, how do you approach an insensitive response like that without triggering? And I think that, you know, part of that is the healing process. Is the more that you give voice to your story, the more that you own your story, the less what anybody else has to say about it is going to matter. Not that it won't affect you, it will, but it's when I own my truth, when I'm walking in my truth, you can't hurt me with it. Because I've already acknowledged it, I've embraced it, and I'm doing what I need to do. So once I own it and embrace it, you can't hurt me with it. You know, so it's a process, and you know, attending things like this, finding a support group, you know, is also helpful with just kind of being able to start to work through the triggers, because honestly, a lot of times I'm still triggered and I never know. I just don't know when it's going to happen. So yes, to answer the question, long story short, Not Just October was an amazing play. It was an amazing experience. And it touched a lot of lives, especially the cast members. It was a life-changing. It really was. It was life-changing.
So I just want to speak to that a little bit, because I was part of the cast, and I don't know what I was expecting going in. I didn't expect to work as hard as I did, but I did. And what it helped me to realize is I was battling between the shame of my mother's story and what I was going through. And so the reason why I volunteered to be a part of Not Just October is because, and I had this long conversation with Wanda on the phone one night, and I said, I don't know if I have the right to be a part of this play, because I was not abused, but between the ages of 7 and 9 or 7 and 10, I watched my mother violently attacked, and didn't realize until my early 50s that this was called something, and that I had these scars, and I just I never had a formal way of dealing with what I had saw. It happened. I made the phone calls that I was trained to make. They came in, they did what they did. And the next day you got up, you ate a bowl of cereal, and you just went on with life as if it didn't happen. So there was no unpacking. There was no talking about it. And so the reason why I wanted to get in to do what I do is to help be a voice for children who are witnessing this at a young age. I think there's more work being done now with children. A lot of the domestic violence resources are catering towards children and getting them into counseling and therapy, you know, at a young age, which is not something that I had access to. So being able to speak up for that little girl in me was so healing. And even the night of the play, my grandmother played a very critical role in my safety plan. I didn't even know that's what it was until I participated in the play. It was her birthday. And I didn't realize it until my scene came. I was on stage and completely lost it. Like this emotion just came over me, because I felt like it was a full circle moment, that I had gone from that place of not even really knowing what in the world is this? Like, how did I get here? And why is this happening to me? To a reconciliation, and in a position where I was able to now use my voice in a constructive way. So, so thank you, Wanda, for sharing that. So I want to go back to you, Shavar. And this, again, this is not to slant this to men versus women, but I think you just can't have this conversation given the statistics without talking about it. what is it that we can do, and we just in general, to, if we know of a situation where there's an abuser, we're connected to a friend or family member, community, you're going to start the conversation, but I want to hear from everybody. What is it that we do? What do you do? How do you respond? Especially you in a circle and you become aware of a man that might be abusing someone, or you've witnessed some things. How do you handle it? What do you do?
Yes. So what I do is, which may or may not be ideal, and I've seen a few over the last few years. I intervene. I jump in and have conversations with the man about what's appropriate. I've visited many. As I told you, we were in a shelter for a while, so I visit shelters pretty often. And women, overwhelmingly, women will tell their stories. And I'd say 3 of those, they asked, they didn't have a problem with me reaching out and talking to the gentleman. And then I would refer him either to Essex County Family Justice Center, where they would connect, if they were open to it, would connect the gentleman with services. So for me, the first thing is I want to make sure safety. So I want to make sure there's first physical safety for the victim, and at least in all of ones I'm involved in, the victim is a woman. The shelter situation to me is just very problematic. Why should the victim be on the run and having to look over their shoulder because we have a person who's a perpetrator? So and I'm a lawyer, and I used to work with the state, so I'm able to, I can make calls, and I'm able to let folks know that, you're going to be locked up, right? I mean, if you can't get it together, we're going to have to deal with it that way, which is very suboptimal, right? So I'm not, ideally we can get the person treatment and healing, and they can get to a better place, and I'll make referrals to the expert to help them there. I tend to be in a position of, we gotta, if you can't, until you do your work, if that means you want to bring violence, then we gotta put you in the box so that this woman can be safe and protected. And to be honest with you, I also, work with certain women when these men want to keep coming, to say, we gotta enable you to protect yourself, right? So that means we gotta, depending on the state, New Jersey, you can't get a carry permit, and I work with people in different states. Some states you can get a carry permit. It's very hard to get that in New Jersey. So if you have to get a permit at home, I mean, that's not ideal what we have to deal with, but we have some men who just don't stop. And if they're not going to stop, I'm like, we're not going to just have to have our whole life on hold, and we're running, and we got to have our head on a swivel. We're going to put the warning out there. And then there's ways we can create a situation legally where he comes within a certain space, you can shoot first. So no, this isn't, this may not be this isn't the ideal situation. But when you look at those statistics, and that you laid the situation out with, some men, by the time they get their healing, it's too late for the victim, right? So the person who killed my mom, he'll write letters to my sister's his daughter, so it's my stepfather. So my sister, that's her dad. So he'll write letters to her talking about all the healing he's going through, which is a beautiful thing, and I'm happy he's getting that. That ain't bringing my mother back. Right. And that's not, so my sister was 6 months old. I was 10 years old. So I've had over 35 years of trauma associated with that. Mm-hmm. My sister throughout her whole entire life. And so my point of all that is, because of where he was at that point, and maybe it's not a beautiful thing to say, Jesus will help me. If somebody had to be dead, I'd rather be him and not my mom, is the bottom line, because he was the one bringing the violence. And so that's what I work to do, Annette, is I work to connect people with the experts who can help them with the healing, but then I'll work with the victim, and when I have to, the perpetrator, to figure out what can I do to be a facilitator of creating safety, and to put the person on notice that if you want to continue down that path, there's going to be harsh consequences coming your way, one way or another as well.
Yeah, and it took me a minute to get used to and appreciate your perspective, Shavar, because I know you as this, just kind of quiet and, very intellectual person. So the first time I heard your perspective on that, I was a little like, oh.
Yeah, I've been through about that. So I try to control that. I try to, but it slips out. On this subject, it flips out.
I have a greater appreciation for it now, though.
Can I just say something? Yeah. And I'm glad that we're having this real discussion. It's time to remove the veil. These are the experiences that victims go through, and even as a child. And we have to stop looking at children as just being exposed to domestic violence, because they are actual victims as well. And then even the mindset of people saying you need to get over it or you need to forgive, that may not be your process. And sometimes Jesus just set the bar too high, and it's like you're not ready, and you can, and it's more damage to force people to forgive someone who inflicted pain and harm to them. They don't have to forgive if they don't want to forgive, and they say forgiveness is about you. Well, if the forgiveness is about you, then it should be your choice. If that person is still not connected to you and a part of your life, and you have nothing to do with that person, and then you have to look at if the person asked for forgiveness, and even if they did, you don't owe them your forgiveness. You owe yourself your healing. And you can heal without forgiving, and especially if that person is not going to be a part of your life.
Althea, you preaching now, because that is the God's honest truth. And I'm gonna tell you something. Wanda knows this story. I'm gonna tell you something. One of the things I discovered was, as a child, I learned survival and aggressiveness and protect yourself. And what that did for me as I was growing up and not having therapy or counseling or anybody unpacking all of this stuff for me, was it made me angry, it made me bitter, it made me aggressive. You could not even raise your voice. If you elevated your voice to me in the slightest amount, I was ready to fight. I've been married 36 years, and my husband knows I tell this story all the time. I've been married I don't know how he put up with me for as long as he did. I must have moved back home my first year of marriage at least 15 times. Like, my mother was like, if you come back home, I'm just not gonna open this door for you no more. Like, if we had a disagreement or he didn't agree with me, I'd be like, oh, I'm out. This was fun, take care. Because I did not trust what could potentially be coming on the other side of the disagreement. Because what I saw as a child was, if my mother ever disagreed with her abuser, she got the life beat out of her. She got beat down and knocked out. And so I did not know how to process disagreement. I didn't know how to process, everything to me felt aggressive. Everything. And so I share that because, not because I'm proud of it. I had a horrible attitude, and I had to do a lot of work. But I share that because these are real side effects of growing up, witnessing this stuff and not getting any help, and just seeing it play out over and over again. And if nobody's helping you unpack it as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult, it doesn't disappear. It just carries with you. And it manifests in whatever way that it manifests. So
and Annette, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
I just want to piggyback on what Althea said too about forgiveness, because I am the perfect example of that. So my abuser was I was married to him, and he was my daughter's father. So my daughter's father and my abuser are two totally different experiences. And so that's a whole nother conversation in and of itself, because they watched it. And Annette, as I look back and in hindsight, my daughters have that mentality. They're very opinionated. They're very, I don't mean that they're strong-willed. They're very strong, but they have very little tolerance. They have very little tolerance. And I don't think I even put those pieces together until I started to hear you talk about it. But as far as forgiveness goes, he's deceased now of quite a few years. But you mentioned something that was really key, because he never gave me a reason to forgive him. He never did. And it's only been recently, maybe in the last 5 or 6 years, that if someone brings him up, I'm able to say he's deceased, because I used to say he's dead, because that, I can't explain it, but it would annoy me if somebody asked me about him, because I don't. So that would be my response. And so the best I could do in terms of me getting over it and whatever semblance of letting go, forgiveness, whatever you want to call it, was to refer to him as being deceased or passed away, as opposed to saying he's dead. And that was just a big difference for me. It just really was, because again, this is my daughter's father. And that experience was completely, the relationships and the experience was just completely different. So I definitely understand about the forgiveness piece, because to this day, I don't think I ever have. I don't even know what that would feel like.
And again, the reason you're using, and I'm just gonna guess that the reason that you're using dead is because it gives finality to something that was very painful in your life, and you know that it can't come back, to harm me again. It's dead. And forgiveness, people get stuck on forgiveness, but I'm not an all the way heathen. I know the word, in the Bible too. There are some if you want to go from Peter, look at Peter. He fussing, cussing some things, and he was a disciple of God. But even Jesus himself, he tore up temples and dried up fig trees. All of those things. If your forgiveness is your journey, and no one else can tell you how to forgive or when to forgive. I remember a couple of years ago speaking at a church event for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and someone asked me, did I ever forgive my stepfather? No, he didn't ask, and I didn't offer. And, I knew that once I became of age, I would have nothing to do with him. He will always remain my younger siblings' father, but I knew I wasn't going to have anything to do with him. I can't say if I would have given him. He never asked for it, and he's dead. Once I became of age, he was a non-factor in my life. So I felt no need to forgive him. And that was my journey and a part of my healing. No one can tell you that you have to forgive someone. The forgiveness is for you, yes, but it's for you alone. And it doesn't mean that you have to offer it to someone else.
Mm-hmm. And you know what? I'm probably getting so much trouble for saying this, and this is another whole show, another whole discussion, is religion versus reality. So, because there's a whole lot of this going on in the church that nobody's talking about, but I'm just going to leave that there. So, Makya, what else do you want to add to the discussion in terms of Oshun's Garden? What kind of programming, what kind of work? Because we want people to know the resources that are available. I know you're in the Maryland Eastern Shore. I'm going to ask this of Wanda. We're in the New Jersey area, but what are some of the things that you want to bring to the community?
So I think before I go into that, I just want to say one thing, and I think it's important not only for those who are going to be involved with Oshun's Garden, but anybody watching this and those that we all come into contact with. I think that when we're talking about any system of violence or any type of, system of repression, we always ask ourselves, like, am I the problem? Like when we think about racism, am I a racist? And I think that we should transition the conversation from am I the problem to what extent am I upholding this system that's creating the problem, right? So not am I an abuser, to what extent am I upholding the systems that create this system that perpetuates violence against Black women? So it's the sexist language. Am I allowing my friends to joke about women in such a way? Or am I saying things that could come off as abusive to another person? So I think that shift of the attitude is where I would like everyone to start to think about. And then in terms of Oshun.
Wait a minute. I want you to slow down, because you just said a whole lot right there. And I think we just got to pause on that for a minute. Because I think you are absolutely right. And when we talk about denormalizing and deconstructing, it is, what role are we playing in those conversations? Or when we witness and we see things. And I've been involved in conversations lately where people say things like, well, it's none of my business. I'm not inserting myself in the problem. It doesn't have anything to do with me. Or I've heard people justify behavior and say, well, the person never hit me. They may have punched a hole in the wall and taken the door off the hinges, but they never hit me. So I think we need to land there for a minute and expand on that, Makya, and what you mean, and what do we need to do differently?
So again, it just goes back to some of the, I'm so happy that you mentioned the church, because I think about the church and the shame that often comes from the church is what I feel is missing. And that's one key part that I feel I want Oshun's Garden to get to too, in front of religious communities, because a lot of times it's like people, if we're thinking about intimate partner violence, someone may feel like, oh, I can't, divorce my partner because it's going to disappoint my pastor,
Mm-hmm.
or the pastor knows that these things are happening in the church, but
Mm-hmm.
what's being said about it? But we'll definitely have a conversation about how a woman should present herself or how she should be acting. She needs to be a lady. We want to have those conversations, but when it comes to things that threaten the lady, we're not having those. And I think because the Black community has that religious foundation, even those who don't consider themselves religious still uphold those religious notions and still have this traditional framework that again leads to this culture of violence that we're all claiming that we want to get rid of. So it just goes back to our attitudes, um, and that it's a culture shift that has to happen at this point. It's so and that's what Oshun's Garden is to me, because a lot of times with crisis centers, right, and other organizations, they focus mainly on response. I think response is too late. We have to get to a point where we're talking about what even gets us to this place where this violence can happen, and that goes back to the norms and the attitudes and the biases.
That's one of the things, Shavar, that I really admire and respect about you. I follow Shavar on social media, and you will put out articles, and you will say, this is ridiculous, or this needs to happen. You will add your legal perspective to it, or you will call out that behavior. And I think that's one of the things that is missing. I think that's something that we have an opportunity to do more of. You don't always have to put yourself in harm's way. You have a relationship with the people that you work with, Shavar, so it may be easier for you to insert yourself than someone else. And I don't think we're expecting people to put their life in harm's way in any way, but we can certainly use our voice to speak up and speak out against some of the stereotypical beliefs and this inappropriate behavior. Althea, do you have, oh, I'm sorry, Shavar, were you gonna respond to that?
Oh no, I thought you were coming to me, but if
Oh,
you're going
okay.
out there, I'll absolutely wait my turn.
But I was going to say, Althea, as someone who's trained in this space, what would be some tips or guidance that you could give us? Like, how do we speak up? What do we, because we research shows that it's at that point where a person decides to exit, a woman decides to exit, that it is the most critical time and it's the most life-threatening time for that person. And so I want to talk about some strategies that we can use. We're witnessing this, we're observing this, but sometimes how we respond could put that person in even more danger. So can you talk about like some strategies and things that we can do that can help us exercise our voice and do something, but not put the person in more danger than they already are?
I would say a big part of it is to cut out the shaming and saying you haven't left yet, or you need to leave. Developing a safe word. Like if things become too overwhelming for them, you can like, I need a bacon maple cupcake. That's your keyword, or whatever that you can text to your friend, or you checking on them, having a keyword that they know that you're checking on them to respond that they're okay. Because at the end of the day, people will leave relationships when they're ready. And sometimes it takes a lot of work. It takes them to get to self-actualization. And I remember having sessions, like some sessions when I work with victims, it would be the last session so we can lock down the building and lock down my office. And they have to park their car like buildings down just in case they're being followed. So it is a danger. And that's what a lot of people don't understand, is that there is a danger with leaving domestic violence situations. So you want to make sure that they have the resources, and that's providing the support. Be their support. If they come to you and you're tired of hearing it, don't lash out at them. switch them over. It's okay to say, you know what, I've reached my capacity for this week or for this month to hear this. Let's see if we can connect you with someone else because you have to get this out. But definitely the biggest thing is creating that safety, and they have to get to a point. They will know when enough is enough. They will know when they've reached their capacity. As a mental health professional, like I said before, it's not my job to say it's time for you to go. It's to help you to stay safe in the environment you choose to be in, and especially with your kids as well, creating that plan for your kids when they're, because what trauma is, it's not psychological, it's more physiological. And that's why when kids go into school, they're seeing that fight, flight, and freeze. The school is seeing all of these behaviors. They need to get that out. So having your kids doing some type of activity when they're after the witnessing it is over and the abuser leaves the house or goes to bed, have your kid like do some jumping jacks or some type of physical activity to release that anxiety that's trapped in their bodies. But speaking up, giving them information, education is so important. Doing the things that we're doing now with this panel, going to events and getting educated about domestic violence, and just becoming a support to victims.
Mhm. Mhm.
Annette, can I jump in real
Yeah.
quick?
Mhm.
Yeah, I definitely agree. With Althea and everything that we're talking about in terms of changing the narrative too. A lot of times, because I'm at a phone line, and a lot of the calls that I get are from friends and family and loved ones who they want to develop the plan for the victim and go back and tell them what it is that they're going to do, and what it is that they need to do. And like Althea said, my job at that point is to educate them, because I can't tell that friend or family member or loved one what to do either. But what I can do is give them some information so that they have a better understanding of what they're dealing with. And that it's not as simple as going in and storming the house and snatching up and all that kind of stuff. It's not that simple. It sounds good. And when you're upset and it's your loved one and you want to protect them, that's going to be your first resource, is to go get them and make them leave. But victims are, like Althea mentioned earlier, they've been traumatized. And when you have experienced trauma, your thinking and all of that is off. A lot of times victims, they're coping in their own way. And a lot of times that involves drugs and alcohol. And so that also increases their inability to think straight, their inability to plan, they've just numbed themselves. And so it's really important, like Althea mentioned, education and understanding what you're dealing with and the variables are very important, because a lot of times, friends and family, call me if you need me, anytime. If you don't mean that, don't say that. Because you will get a call at 3 o'clock in the morning. You will get a call at 1:30 in the afternoon. And if a victim calls you and you're really ready to help, and they tell you to be at their house at 3:16, be at their house at 3:16. If you can't be there at 3:16, then tell them you can't do it, because the victims understand their abuser, they understand their window. And so a lot of times, having a conversation with victim, they may say things that sound ridiculous to us. It sounds ridiculous because we're not going through it. So, definitely have that empathy, and definitely, like Althea said, get all of the information that you can so that you can make the decision for yourself as to whether or not you're going to be able to be a support, because some people can't. Yeah. And and it's okay. But the other thing to what Makya was saying about changing the narrative, right? Instead of asking why don't they leave, start asking, how can I help you? How can I help you? Keep your judgments and your bias and all that kind of stuff literally to yourself. If you need to say it, call somebody else and say it to them. Call me, you can call me and you can say it to me. Do not say it to your friend or loved one. What you want to say to them is, how can I help you? Because they'll tell you. If they trust you, they'll tell you.
That was one of the biggest aha moments for me, going through my training over the years, because I had a lot of judgment towards my mom. And it was strange that I formed that judgment at such an early age, but I never saw her as a victim. I saw her as, well, why are you taking this? And I don't know where I got that from at such a young age, but at 7 and 8 and 9 years old, I was looking at her like, why are you dealing with this? Like, why are you taking this? And why are you subjecting us to this? And so going through the training that I've gone through over the years, it helps me to change the narrative in my own head towards my mom, and to finally see her as a victim, like she was a victim. And I can only imagine, I can't really even imagine why she made the decisions that she did, um, to go through, what she went through. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we can do as advocates, is to encourage people to not judge. Don't judge. You don't know why people are going through what they're going through, or you're not. Even if you wear the same size shoes and you can walk in a person's shoes, you'll never be able to walk in their shoes. So the whole judgment was a very big learning moment for me. Um, Wanda, talk about the safety plan, because that I thought was very educational too, that came out of the play. Is a woman is in her mind, a person is in their mind right now saying, I'm getting out of this abusive relationship, I'm gonna leave. What do they need to do?
So, like Althea and all of us mentioned already, that the time when a victim decides to leave, it really is the most dangerous time. And so safety planning became very important to me, because that's how I left. And at the time, like you mentioned, I didn't know that there was a name for what I was doing. I just knew that other attempts at just functioning in general were being stopped by him. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't do anything. And every time I tried to, there was some kind of repercussion. And so my brother was getting married. Long story, just real quick. My brother was getting married, and I knew that he would let me go to my brother's wedding. Okay, because abusers, they're not stupid. They know how to read the room. If I didn't show up at my brother's wedding, that was going to be a problem. So I knew he would let me go. So what I did was, where my brother was getting married at, I started making some phone calls about shelters. And so I found a shelter, and what I did was, again, this just goes back to victims knowing their abusers and knowing the schedules and so forth. I knew that on Thursday evenings between 3 and 11, he wasn't going to be home. So my aunt and my mother at that time came every Thursday, and they started packing things and taking it out of the house, because the plan was, when I went to my brother's wedding, I wasn't coming back. And again, I knew my abuser. I knew what rooms he was going to go into. I knew what drawers I knew all of that. So again, that was part of the plan: what to take out, when to take out, and how to, kind of put things back so nothing looked different. And that's what happened when I went to my brother's wedding. I had the majority of my clothes, special things for the children, and definitely all my important papers. And I made copies, other people had them, and so forth. But so safety planning looks different for everybody, because, and I'm going to use COVID now as an example, where you're not able to get out at all, and victims have been isolated. A safety plan for that scenario is going to look different to when we were free to move around. So with the safety plan, when you're isolated like that, it becomes staying safe in the house. What could be used as a weapon, hiding the weapon. And it's things just as simple as having a blanket or something next to you, so that if something jumps off and he or she starts to get physical, you can cover yourself. Like it's things like that you have to take a look at, just in your own situation. But the one thing that safety planning does too is that it just helps you really to start to get the strength and the courage. Because when you start to take control, it's all, it's a subtle thing. But I found that when I've worked with victims on safety planning, I start to see them sit up a little straighter, because now this is something that they're in control of. So it's very individual, Annette. It's individual, but it encompasses things like the lay of your home, how you go to and from work, or to and from, you're traveling. Who are the people that you can trust? Do you need to have kind of like an underground railroad kind of thing? Like, people don't think about that, but it's real. And so safety planning is something that I definitely speak to people about as often as I can, because it does work. But I've also found that it starts to give the victim a little bit more of their voice back, because it's something that they can now be in control of. And they kind of start to go, wait a minute, I have to plan. Like, I really have to, I got to plan to stay safe. I have to plan so that okay. So I've just had like light bulbs go off just in that process.
Althea, would you add anything to that?
Nope, that Wanda said it all. The safety planning, and I've seen victims start to sit up and start to gain more confidence and self-awareness and gaining that strength. And that is their process. It takes some shorter time for some, longer time for others, but they're gaining that strength, and they are starting to feel empowered and through their safety planning, because like Wanda said, I have control over this. But I would add, even for the kids, teaching kids to ground themselves is so important, especially like you mentioned, Wanda, in COVID, and they're witnessing, and witnessing is not just seeing, it's hearing. It's becoming afraid when the perpetrator or the abuser's car pull up to the driveway, or you hear them coming into the door. So giving them the permission to ground themselves, having them to go to a safe space in the house, and then going to a safe space in their mind, or a safe place in their mind that brings them happiness or joy, so they can ground themselves to get them through all of the ruckus that's going on between the adults.
I'll share this. I rock, and I've been doing a lot of webinars lately. And I'll go back and I'll watch the recording, and I'm like, darn it, I can't stop doing it. And I developed that as almost like a nervous tick from when I was a kid. And I would rock when I would be in the other room, and I would hear things, and so I just would rock. It would help my heart rate, and then to this day, I can't stop doing it.
It's a coping skill for you, and actually is a good thing, because like I said, trauma is more physiological, and so that rocking is the releasing for you.
Yes.
The rocking is the releasing for you. So it's actually not a bad thing for me. When I kind of hold myself like this, and I have to be conscious of that when I'm in therapy sessions, because society tells you that people are not paying attention to you, or they defensive if they have their arms crossed. But for me, that's grounding for me. It's giving me permission to be what I need for myself, right? So but that's not a bad thing. That's the physiological response to releasing what's trapped in your body.
But I didn't even realize I was doing it. I was in therapy talking to the therapist, and she asked me, she said, how do you feel when you're rocking? Like, when does it? And I was like, I'm not rocking. Like, it just happened. I didn't even, and so she even helped put that in context for me. So we share these stories to those that are listening, because this is how you denormalize and deconstruct abusive relationships. When people have a space, a respectful and a safe place where they can share their stories and share their path, their journey on healing, and what they're doing as in terms of advocacy work, it helps to denormalize. Like, this is not normal. These experiences are not normal. The effects of these experiences that we've gone through are not normal. It is not normal to go to bed in fear with a person who says they love you. It is not normal to not feel comfortable being your authentic self with a person who loves you. It is not normal as a child to hide under beds or to lock yourself in a bathroom because your parents or one of your parents and their partner is fighting. These things are not normal, but the reality is they have an effect on us. And so I'm watching the time. We're getting down to the last few minutes. I did check the chat room. I don't see any new questions, but maybe somebody else can just take a look. But I want to close out with two things. One, I want to share the national hotline number. This is a national hotline number. It's 800-799-SAFE, S-A-F-E. 800-799-SAFE, S-A-F-E. It is a national hotline. You can call that. You can speak to someone who is trained and skilled at helping people who are in abusive relationships exit safely, find shelter, align them with resources, get guidance, get direction on what you should do next. So please, if you are in a situation, if you're fearful, if you don't know what to do, or if you know you want to leave but you don't know how, you can reach out. You can call that number, 800-799-SAFE, S-A-F-E, and you can get guidance and direction on how to move forward.
And Annette, if I could just add, for teenagers, teenagers and young adults, there is a website. It's called loveisrespect.org. And it's a really good website. It's geared to teenagers and young adults, but there's tons of resources on there. They have some interactive activities, they have webinars, but it's a very good, safe place for young adults and teenagers. And on the, I don't have the number with me, but on the website, it does give a phone number, and if a young adult or teenager needs to call, they speak to a peer. So they have
and what is it called? Love is
respect.
Loveisrespect.org.
Yep,
Okay.
loveisrespect.org.
Maybe we can post it as a resource, Makya, after the panel discussion. We'll put it in the Facebook page. Yeah, because and don't quote me, but the statistics, I saw statistics, and I think it was like ages 16 to 24 or 17 to 24 is the highest number of intimate partner violence, incidents of intimate partner violence. So think about that. That's happening in high school at the senior level, and it's going into college campuses, right? So it's happening on our college campuses as well. I thought it would be nice for us to close with a call to action, right? And to hear from each of you. If you could say something to speak to, denormalizing or deconstructing abusive relationships, or speaking to the myths and stereotypes, the taboo-ness. I mean, I think one of the things that frustrates me so much is how this is still looked at as such a taboo thing. Well, if the person should just leave. If the person didn't want to be in an abusive relationship, they wouldn't be in an abusive relationship. So I'd like to hear from each of you. What's the call to action? What do we want people to know and do as a result of this conversation? And I'm going to start with you, Makya.
I'm going to say to understand that we each have a responsibility in this fight, right? So one, educating yourself and aligning with, other organizations or us who may be, trying to do the work, but also recognizing that, and again, this is trying to get a different audience and a younger audience, even though we need to find a balance, getting people to understand that the role doesn't have to be, I'm an advocate or boots on the ground in the community. You can literally use your art, use your social media. It's so easy to get involved in, and I think for some people, they just have to find a way. So I'm hoping that they'll connect themselves with organizations like Oshun's Garden to lead the way.
Thank you. Wanda, what do you want people to know and do?
Being in a relationship or any type of situation where harm is being caused to you, and you're being mentally and physically manipulated, I'd like people to just understand that it's not as easy to walk away, and that victims as well as survivors, they just need support. And so I always, my 3 words, Annette, you know, is listen to them, believe what they tell you, and then support them. So my thing is just listen, believe, support. You don't have to have the answers, because a lot of times there is no definite answer. So listen, believe, and support.
Okay. Althea?
Okay, so can I take this from a layperson standpoint? Again, the support is important. If you have a loved one that you know or suspect that's in a domestic violence situation, cook a meal. Give them a reprieve to cook a meal, take a meal over. Something as simple as that could be, or as minimal as that can shift their attitude about what's going on with them, give them a little bit of reprieve, but definitely being the support and educating yourself on domestic violence, and stop the victim shaming and the victim blaming. And from a professional standpoint, for professionals working with people who are victims and perpetrators, get the appropriate training. It's more than going to a website and reading a couple of articles or attending a webinar or a couple of training. This is ongoing, and it's different for everyone. And from a cultural standpoint, stop telling Black families to dismantle their family. That is not helpful. As a professional, learn the importance of family in the Black community and work with them from that standpoint. Show some humility and some compassion and some empathy all the way around.
Okay. Shavar?
Yeah, I have a call action to the men. I would say to the men, while recognizing large numbers of men are working to do the right thing, be thoughtful, we still have too many that's causing this issue. Based on the stats and that you laid out at the beginning, at least on the heterosexual question, this is largely a male against, there's a male perpetrator and a female victim. So men, we got to get ourselves together. Let's engage in that therapy that we need so that we can be the best human beings that we can be. Let's deal with trauma we may have seen in our own childhood as we were coming up that we just never resolved. We didn't think it was cool to resolve, or we just didn't even know that there were tools to help us resolve that trauma. Let's work on ourselves so that we could be the best that we could be. And a part of that is not also at the micro level. I think it's to build on something that Makya spoke about earlier. The reality is we have a culture which, for most of human history, has been very much rooted in patriarchy. I mean, women didn't even have the right to vote in this country until 1920. Women didn't have the right to vote in a whole variety of different industries really until the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And that just began to change some of the laws. We know today there's huge gaps in terms of pay equity for women. There's huge gaps in terms of ability for women to access capital, to build businesses. And we know in our culture, and I'll come to some of our Black pop culture, hip hop music is thoroughgoing with misogyny and patriarchy all over the place. You can't turn on a video without seeing women being sexually objectified and men kind of exerting dominion over a woman's body. So my point is, we got to call that out too, right? We cannot purchase music. We cannot purchase entertainment that is fueling, these sort of images into our community. So both at the micro level in terms of individual work, each man can and should and must do so that he can be the best he ought to be. We need men to engage in that work. So I have a call to action there. And we also have a macro set of activities where as men, we can call our culture to account so that our culture is more aligned with the types of values that we want to see in terms of how men interface with women and have healthy relationships.
Wow, that's powerful. And for me, what I would want people to know and do, I would speak directly to our young women. I have two daughters, and it's a conversation that unfortunately we've had to have throughout the years. And love doesn't hurt. So if someone is saying to you that they love you, they are not put black in your eye. They are not knocking out your teeth. They are not threatening your life You are not in fear or should not be in danger with someone who loves you. And I would say find a safe way, a discreet way to call the safe number, the 800-799 safe number, or go to loversrespect.org, but find a safe and discreet way for you to get help and to find a way to get out of that abusive relationship. And look for warning signs, you know, even if you're not being physically abused. Control, not love. Name calling, not love. Putting you down, not love. Keeping you from your dreams, your visions, your friends, your family members, not love. So that's what I would say, is to love yourself enough to get out of that situation and to move forward with your life. I'm going to say to each of you, I cannot think of a better way to spend 90 minutes on a Saturday afternoon than spending it with you to help educate and raise awareness around this topic that's near and dear to my heart and all of you as well. And I want to just say thank you so much for all the work that you do. I have learned and I am growing because of my interactions with each of you. I'm going to be a little biased here and say, Shavar Jeffries, you know, I love you and your family. Thank you so much for always unselfishly giving your time and being willing to lend your voice and your expertise to this topic. Appreciate you so much. And I want to leave the last final words. We have 3 minutes left, and the farewell comments to Makya, the founder of Oshun's Garden.
First of all, can we thank Annette? You are a wonderful moderator. And I said that the last time when you moderated for PFLAG, but truly, so I also echo her and thank you to all of the panelists for taking time out to join us today. We didn't even know each other prior to this event, right? And you all said yes, so I'm eternally grateful for that. But I also just wanted to let people know that if they wanted to follow Oshun's Garden, you can find us on social media. Facebook is just Oshun's Garden. Instagram is Oshun's Garden MD, and then our website is www.oshunsgarden.org. So if you go to
spell Oshun for them, spell Oshun.
It's OSHUNS garden.org. So if you go to our website, you can get on our mailing list and you'll be the first to know about all of our events and initiatives. And if you wanted to donate to our work, you'll find all of that on the website. So thank you again for the panelists not only joining us today, but the attendees who also took 90 minutes out of their Saturday to join us today.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your Saturday and your weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
God bless.
Bye.